Good morning. Again, as usual for Wednesday morning, I'm sitting here in my office, my indoor office again, as opposed to my outdoor office, with the second cup of coffee, and we'll talk some church things, talk some things of the Spirit, and hopefully our time together over the next 10, 15 minutes be, hopefully it'll be useful. This past Sunday was Pentecost Sunday in the life of the church, and I referred to Pentecost last week when we were together, and at least in my church's Sunday, we read Acts chapter 2, 1 through 21, and I suppose that text was read at nearly every church everywhere. On Pentecost Sunday, I think pretty much everybody would be reading that same text from Acts chapter 2, which describes the outpouring of the Holy Spirit. So Pentecost is said to be the birthday of the church. Sometimes it's the day in which the Holy Spirit was poured out upon the disciples as they were gathered in the upper room. Now, that initial Pentecost experience was characterized by several different things. And I'm going to read just the first portion of Acts chapter 2, sort of a lead-in to where I'm going to go today. When the day of Pentecost arrived, they were all together in one place. And suddenly there came from heaven a sound like a mighty rushing wind, and it filled the entire house where they were sitting. And divided tongues as of fire appeared to them and rested on each of them. And they were all filled with the Holy Spirit and began to speak in other tongues as the Spirit gave them utterance. Now there were dwelling in Jerusalem Jews, devout men under every nation under heaven. And at this sound the multitude came together, and they were bewildered, because each one is hearing them speak in his own language. And they were amazed and astonished, saying, "Are not all these who are speaking Galileans? How is it that we hear each of us in his own native language, Parthians and Medes and Elamites, and residents of Mesopotamia, Judea and Cappadocia, Pontus and Asia, Phrygia and Pamphylia, Egypt and the parts of Libya belonging to Cyrene, and visitors from Rome, both Jews and proselytes, Cretans and Arabians? We hear them telling in our own tongues the mighty works of God." So that's the beginning of the description of what happened at Pentecost when the Holy Spirit was poured out upon the disciples. And in Church Sunday, if you were watching on Facebook Live or YouTube, I really dwelt on two things. That when the Spirit filled that room, it was a mighty wind. This wasn't a gentle breeze, it was a mighty wind. Same wind that Elijah had encountered up on the top of Mount Horeb, and then we're told that divided tongues of fire appeared in the room. Again, the same fire that Elijah encountered on the top of Mount Horeb, the same fire that Moses had encountered in the burning bush back in Exodus 3. The wind and the fire of God filled the room where they were. And then as the wind and the fire from the Holy Spirit filled the room, these disciples start speaking, and they start speaking in tongues, it is said. And this is the first instance in the New Testament, at least, where we know that there is speaking in tongues. And that's sort of where I want to go today. Take just a few minutes to talk about this business of speaking in tongues. Does it still happen? What was it then? What is it now? So in this instance at Pentecost, the disciples start speaking in tongues, and clearly there's something unique and novel about what's going on, because the bystanders think they're drunk even though it's only 9 in the morning. It's too early in the day to be drinking. But what's going on? As the disciples are speaking, we have these people there from all over the known world who are there for the festival. Like I mentioned last week, Pentecost was the ancient Feast of Weeks, and one of the pilgrimage days, one of the pilgrimage festival days for Jews, when anybody who could went to Jerusalem. So the city is full of people, and the disciples start speaking, and as they start speaking and praising God, people there from all over the place hear the disciples talking in their own languages. So at least at Pentecost, you could say it's more a miracle of hearing than it is a miracle of speaking. So it'd be something like this. I'm speaking to you in good Eastern North Carolina English. But if there's somebody here listening to me from Germany, they hear me in German. I'm speaking Eastern North Carolina English, but somebody who is listening to me in Germany hears me in German. And at the same time, somebody in Korea is listening to me and hears me and understands me in Korean. That seems to be what's going on here in the book of Acts, where it's as an outpouring of the Holy Spirit, people are able to hear and understand in their own languages what the disciples are all saying. They're speaking Aramaic, I suppose, or Greek, but the people that are there from all over hear them in their own native language. So that's one way that we find tongues referred to in the New Testament. Here at Acts chapter 2, where it is a miracle clearly intended towards the spread of the word, you have people there from all over the place who can hear in their own language what the disciples are saying, even though they're only speaking one language. We also find tongues being referred to in the New Testament more as an ecstatic spirit language, which is where Paul comes in with 1 Corinthians 12, 13, and 14. Paul talks about the gifts of the Spirit and lists them all, and in the gifts of the Spirit, he refers to the gift of tongues. So we have in these two places the two primary means that we can understand the gift of tongues. First is the book of Acts, where it's a matter of hearing and understanding in different human languages. And the other use of tongues is, like I said, 1 Corinthians 12, 13, and 14, where it appears to be more of an ecstatic spirit language. Paul lists the speaking of tongues as a gift of the Spirit. Actually, it's fairly down in priority in the list of gifts of the Spirit. And he also lists the gift of interpreting tongues. So there was, within the Corinthian church, there were apparently a group of people there who spoke in tongues quite a bit. And Paul said, yes, that is a gift of the Spirit. And he also said that that there should be people there with the corresponding gift, the gift to be able to understand the tongues. So, speaking biblically in the New Testament, there are the two ways that we find the speaking of tongues. Acts chapter 2, geared towards evangelism, a matter of hearing and speaking human languages. And then we also see it to be an ecstatic spirit language, which is sort of where, as we current believers think about it, is probably where most of us envision the speaking of tongues. So, where do we go from there? Throughout church history, the use of tongues and the speaking in tongues, and actually just the favor, the amount of goodwill, if you will, or positive thought toward tongues sort of has waxed and waned, just like the moon. For a good while after the New Testament era, there's many of the church heavyweights theologically took a pretty dim view of speaking in tongues, probably because they were they had, as they say, bigger fish to fry. They're too busy with the great theological controversies of the 3rd and 4th, 5th centuries to delve much into tongues. But we do find that throughout church history that the appearance of speaking in tongues has sort of come and gone. Like particularly just, we can look at it in the last, say, 500 years. To my knowledge, speaking in tongues wasn't a major part of the Protestant Reformation. I've read that Luther and Calvin both spoke positively towards the gift of tongues, but we don't, to my knowledge at least, see the gift of tongues and speaking in ecstatic spirit languages to be something that is very commonplace in the Protestant Reformation. If you fast forward a little bit to the 1700s, the early Quakers seem to have practiced it a little bit. Wesley, our own ancestor, forefather in the faith, at least allowed for speaking in tongues. And it's curious, in the First Great Awakening, in which, Wesley was one of the primary movers and shakers, there are some really ecstatic things that took place. As a result of Wesley's preaching or other people's preaching at the time, some really strange stuff took place. People falling out on the floor, weeping and wailing, in some cases barking like dogs. So really, really strange stuff that doesn't happen a whole lot in our good, staid, prim, proper Methodist churches anymore. I can't remember the last time somebody fell out on the floor and barked like a dog after one of my sermons. But it's the sort of thing that happened then during the First Great Awakening. Similarly, during the Second Great Awakening, 1800 through 1825, 1830 or so. Similar extravagant reactions to preaching. Currently, where we find speaking in tongues is in the Pentecostal tradition. The Pentecostal churches that all emerged right around 1900, the very end of the 1800s, 1900. There was a great revival that began in 1906 in Los Angeles in Azusa Street, and speaking in tongues was very much a part of that revival. And really ever since then, there's been an undercurrent of tongues, particularly in the Pentecostal churches, those of that tradition, and within Roman Catholic churches, mainline Protestant churches, particularly because I am one, United Methodist Church, there is a movement within these churches towards ecstatic tongues. It doesn't happen a whole lot. It's never happened in one of my services, but there is within the United Methodist Church, there is a movement, a real spirit-filled movement, where it does sometimes happen. Now, as for me, I don't have the gift of tongues. I do well to manage to speak in English. I manage decently to speak in Eastern North Carolina English. I've studied 4 different foreign languages and haven't been any good at any of them. Yes, I did take my obligatory French in high school and college. Don't remember any of it. I took some German in my first graduate degree, have forgotten all of it. Did the obligatory Greek and Hebrew in seminary and wasn't very good at them. I managed English okay. But if I barely manage English okay, it's a guarantee that I'm not going to manage ecstatic tongues. But I'm not in a position to say that other people can't do it and don't do it. I have heard other people speak in tongues, even though I personally never have and doubt that I ever will. But I have heard other people do it. In particular, there was one occasion, I guess 16, 17 years ago, been some years ago, I was sick. I was sick in the bed, and we had a lady who was doing some cleaning for us who came from a church of, her background was Church of God. Wonderful, sweet Christian lady, and she came up to the bedroom and prayed for me. And as she'd come to the house to do some cleaning for us, and as she was praying for me, she lapsed into tongues. And it was powerful. It meant the world to me. I have no idea what she was saying, but she lapsed into tongues as she was speaking to me. So currently, there are some people who would say that the gift of tongues is entirely relegated to the New Testament era. I would disagree with that. Personally, I would disagree with that. There is also within the broader church some people would say that tongues necessarily follows salvation and being filled with the Spirit. And I think clearly the New Testament would disagree with that. I think our best and our safest position is this: to be like the Apostle Paul. It is a gift of the Spirit which some people have and other people don't have. I'm not going to question people who have it. And for me, who at least so far don't have the gift of tongues, don't question whether I'm filled with the Spirit or am saved because I do not speak in tongues. We should allow that it can and does happen at times in some circles within our own church and in other denominational traditions, but we need to show some grace and latitude in this. I don't speak in tongues, but because I don't doesn't mean that other people cannot and should not. Anyway, that is it for today as we reflect backwards towards this past Sunday and the day of Pentecost, the day when wind and fire from God swept through the upper room where the disciples were, and when they began to speak in tongues and people there from all over the place could hear and understand them in their own languages. Preview of coming attractions. This coming Sunday is Trinity Sunday. And so next week I'll take a few minutes on Wednesday morning and reflect on the Trinity. What actually this strange doctrine of the Trinity really is. I hope you all have a great day.